I think that the very idea of negotiation with Russia in itself is a kind of trap.
Do you already understand Donald Trump's strategy for this potential peace settlement?
Putin as a war criminal. And Trump basically doesn't care. We cannot provide Russia with a kind of license to kill.
Is there anything that can make a significant change in this situation?
We have to consider that there is only one war aim, which is the full victory of Ukraine and the radical defeat of Russia.
Mr. Tenzer, it's a pleasure to have you here at Ukraine's public broadcaster, even like this online. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, always to speak to you, Elena.
Thank you very much. Since we are witnessing a large number of news and statements regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war, and also different statements from the new US administration, so I need to inform our audience that this interview is being recorded on the 12th of March, on Wednesday, and the day before, on the 11th of March, the negotiations took place in Saudi Arabia between the American side and Ukrainian side regarding the possible peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine. So let's start with this. What are your impressions of these first statements that you've heard? In particular, we heard that Ukraine agreed to the idea of the 30-day ceasefire on the conditions that the same ceasefire regime will be implemented by Russia.
Well, first of all, I think that was really a kind of tactical success from the Ukrainian part, because as you perfectly know, this ceasefire was already asked by President Zelensky before. And finally, I mean, the Americans just took it over. I mean, his own ideas, and they considered them. And finally, you know, it was a great success also to share for President Zelensky to share his view to others. And of course, I mean, any kind of ceasefire will be very beneficial for the Ukrainian people if implemented by the Russian part, of course, because just to have a kind of respite for at least 30 days, when you see, you know, what happened, you know, in the cities of Kyiv, Odessa, and many others, I mean, just 30 days to sleep. I mean, that will be wonderful for the Ukrainian people, and I think that's a good thing. The second thing is that, of course, it was very, I will say, skillful from the negotiators, Ukrainian negotiators, to obtain that the US will resume their delivery of weapons to Kyiv, and also resume intelligence sharing with the Ukrainian forces. I only think that was a key point, because certainly I think that Ukraine had worked very hard to impose this kind of conditions to the Americans. And I think that if Russia is trying to strike again the Ukrainian forces or the Ukrainian cities, with early warning from the US intelligence, especially when it comes to missiles, will protect and basically save Ukrainian lives. And that's what matters the most. Having said that, first of all, let's wait what Russia will respond. And basically, we perfectly know that Russia doesn't want peace, that Russia wants to destroy Ukraine, to subdue the Ukrainian people. They have absolutely no interest for peace of any kind. So basically, we'll see if Russia agrees or not, and how many times it lasts. And that, of course, we don't know. The second thing is that ceasefire is not a kind of peace agreement. That's not a peace deal. Still you have the question, at what conditions? The first question, there could be, an agreement on peace. And personally, I do not see that Russia will accept to cede the territories, Ukrainian territories that they have captured. I don't see how they will agree with, which is my view, preconditions the return of the deported children, Ukrainian deported children to Russia. I don't know how they will accept also to pay the compensation for the war damages, etc., etc. And that for the moment, for me, the precondition of peace, because you heard, I mean, most of the Western leaders, President Macron, Prime Minister Kerstheimer, and President Duda, and others, they always say, well, basically, we cannot accept that at the end of the day, Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity is not preserved. So basically, I do not see peace talks, and I am still, if you consider, I mean, the previous statements made by the U.S. administration, either Trump or J.D. Vance, or I mean, also Marco Rubio and others, I see there is a kind of, I will say, ideological collision with Russia. So that's why I'm very, very cautious.
Yeah, let me separate a couple of the questions you already mentioned. So, as you mentioned, that we don't yet know the reaction of the Russian side on the negotiations in Saudi Arabia between Ukrainians and Americans. And during this week, we expect that maybe there will be some contacts between Americans and Russians. But in general, in your opinion, does Russia really need a ceasefire on the battlefield right now? Why should it agree on this condition?
Well, I think that for Russia, there is basically no reason for them to agree, but certainly they can fear that Trump himself change his views. Because you see what President Trump said yesterday. He said, well, basically the ball is on, Russian side right now. If Putin say, no, we don't agree to a ceasefire, Trump who want to obtain something, at least to show to the world that he's a great negotiator, that he was able to find a solution, etc. If Russia say no, Putin could fear that at the end of the day, it won't be very beneficial to Russia. I mean, for the Russian peace side, that the only one reason for them to agree. But they could also consider that they have mean of pressure on Trump, and that they do not need to agree. And that, of course, that's part of the unknown.
Among Ukrainians, there is a fair, I think, concern that any ceasefire may be used by Russia just to strengthen its army, its possibilities to attack Ukraine with new, greater force. In your opinion, are there any steps that Ukraine or Ukraine's partner countries may take to counter this?
First of all, if I consider what, the skillfulness of the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces, there is absolutely no comparison between the two. I mean, the Ukrainians are really skillful. They are very mobile. They are able, in 1 month or 2 months during the ceasefire to create great advances in terms of drones industry and missiles industry. Whereas Russia probably will do certainly less than the Ukrainians. So I am very confident that if you have a ceasefire during 1 month and 2 months, finally, at the end of the day, it will be more beneficial for the Ukrainian side and for the Russian side. If it takes, 3 years, maybe that's a different kind of story. And especially if there is a kind of, let's say, if the US decide to lift the sanctions against Moscow, if they decide to resume the trade with Russia and a lot of businesses, then certainly, it will be very more beneficial to Russia. But a truce or ceasefire during 1 or 2 months, I think it will be very good for the Ukrainian. The Ukrainian could rest. The Ukrainian could rebuild also some energy plants that have been damaged by the Russian strikes. And they could probably create more drones and missiles. But of course, there is also a condition, which is, first of all, that you have a protection from the allies. And I think with the new decision to resume the military intelligence sharing with Ukraine, certainly it will be good. And of course, I mean, the Europeans, for their side, must continue and certainly step in the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. That's also conditions that must be met, certainly, for this truce to be beneficial for the Ukrainians.
We see how actively the new US administration has taken up this issue of ending the Russian-Ukrainian war. But many of the statements that we've heard from the White House during the last months, they were, I would say, truly concerning to Ukrainians. Do you already understand Donald Trump's strategy for this potential peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia?
First of all, of course, I am very skeptical about, Trump's, and I think basically there is no plan, in Trump's sides to have a kind of real peace settlement. When the President Zelensky is talking about a fair and a long-standing peace, basically it's not certainly Trump's intention. If we consider what he said before, and what also his advisors said, or Vice President J.D. Vance, or Secretary Rubio and others, basically they are ready to accept compromises that are very detrimental to Ukraine. And for me, it's not a kind of peace plan. That's a plan that will prepare the war, in 3 years or 5 years. Especially because, from what I know, Trump is ready to concede some occupied territories to Russia, saying, well, part of Crimea, or part of Donbass, or Zaporizhia region, Kherson regions, etc. Well, you have to accept compromises, give it to Russians, which is not acceptable. Because that's something that I have to repeat, and I repeat day after day, in the occupied territories, and the Russian joke, you have quite everyday massive rapes. You have deportation of children, crimes of genocide, according to the conventions of December 9th, 1948. You have torture chambers. You have summary executions. And we in the West, I mean the democracies, we cannot provide Russia with a kind of license to kill. So for me, I mean, territory compromises is not acceptable. And you see also that Trump never designate Putin as a war criminal. And Putin is a war criminal. He's a criminal against humanity. He's a criminal, of course, culprit of the crime of genocide. He's a criminal culprits for the crimes of aggressions. You have the 4 categories of crime without any statute of limitations. Decided, in Nuremberg, that basically are characterizing Putin's Russia right now. And Trump basically doesn't care. Trump said nothing also about the compensations, of the war damages. So for me, I mean, the kind of peace, even if there is no clear plan that Trump, is thinking about, is a plan that will basically herald the war that Russia would wage, in 3 years or 5 years to come. And you said before, certainly Russia will take this time to consolidate, I mean, its military might, also to alleviate, I will say, the sufferings of its own economy, which is in a very bad shape, with interest rate between 25 and 30%, with the ruble plummeting, with, of course, the infrastructures, not functioning, inflation rate very high. I mean, everything that we perfectly know. So, I mean, we cannot offer Putin this chance, and especially right now, because what I consider is that Ukrainians are able to make great success in the war. I was mentioning before the drones industry. President Zelensky said basically that there will come very soon a new missiles industry, from Ukraine. Basically, you see, even if there was some progresses made by the Russia in the coast regions because of the lack of intelligence sharing, but still, I mean, if you consider what happened, last year in 2024, in fact, Russia made advance on only 0.6% of the Ukrainian territory. At that speed, it will take 80 years for Russia to conquer, I mean, the entire Ukraine. which is completely mad. So it means basically there is no military success of Russia. And I think that in 3 years from now, if we are stepping in our effort, I mean, we, the Europeans especially, basically Ukraine can win, I am sure, and would be able to reconquer, its lost territories. So it's not the time to make peace, in a way.
One can say that maybe words don't really matter. Yes, what you mentioned, that President Trump, he doesn't say that Russian President Putin is a war criminal, but like it is more important what he does in practice. But what we've heard during this last months were mainly the concessions that the US expects from Ukraine. We didn't really hear what the United States expects from Russia, what they should do to reach this peace in particular. We also heard some conflicting statements, like the statement by the US Secretary of State Rubio that this war is in fact the proxy war between the United States and Russia. So my question is, do you think that this is really possible? That at some moment when there will be, in fact, the negotiations between the Ukrainian and Russian side with the United States in the middle, that the United States really will not ask Russia about anything, about any concessions. So they just so you just need to stop and then we lift sanctions and that's all. Is that possible? I mean, because it looks like this during these last months.
Absolutely. No, you're perfectly right. And basically, that's something that I am afraid of. That's something that I am afraid of because, I mean, that's why I was talking just before about the kind of ideological collision between Russia and the US right now. Basically, they do not care about Ukraine. That you remember the statement made also by J.D. Vance during the campaign. He said basically, well, Ukraine, I don't care. And if you consider, also what, and he's supposed to be more moderate than others, what also General, Case Kellogg said, saying, well, basically we have to beat a little bit Ukraine, and then of course Ukraine will go the right way, which is very insulting, I mean, to the Ukrainian people. So basically, that's why, and that's something that I am saying since the very beginning. That's something that I was emphasizing on, also in my latest book on the war. That basically we cannot make any concession to Russia. Any kind of even to talk about negotiation with Russia, in my view, is completely meaningless. There can be no negotiation with a criminal power. We have to defeat Russia. And I think that the fact even that the Americans accept the principle of so-called negotiation shows that they are ready to accept any kind of concession. And I think that at the end of the day, it will be very, of course, dangerous and very ominous also for Ukraine, but also for Europe and for the security of the US. And that's why, I think that the very idea of negotiation with Russia in itself is a kind of trap.
Is there anything that can make a significant change in this situation? Because the overall look at what you are saying makes me think about a very pessimist estimations of what will be happening. Is there any ways that Ukraine or Ukraine's partners in Europe, for example, may say or do to influence the current new US administration's views and policies in particular?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Personally, I'm very pessimistic about that. I think that even if you have Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, Donald Tusk, and others saying, well, we want to talk to Mr. Trump again, we want to convince him that he has to change his mind, etc. I think it's basically, unfortunately, well, they are doomed to fail. Not that they are not convincing, not that they are not trying to do their best to persuade Trump, but I think that the ties between Russia and Trump's US are so deep, and also that there are so many, I would say, ideological similarities about Putin's way of thinking and Trump's.
So when you say that these relations, they are so deep, what do you mean? So you mean this ideological way of thinking about politics, or?
I mean two things. First of all, you know perfectly, and it was well documented by a lot of writers, filmmakers, etc., that you had a very long history of relationship, even before Putin, between Trump and Russia. That certainly the Russians many times basically saved Trump's companies from bankruptcy. And so, I mean, it creates some links. It created some links. But beyond that, which is well documented, beyond that, if you see the worldview, what the Germans call Weltanschauung, between Trump and Putin, there are so many similarities. Full neglect for the rule of law, kind of contempt for international law. In their word, basically, there is no difference between the aggressor and the attacked country. No differences between the culprit and the victim. A kind of indifference for the sufferings of the people. And also the very idea that only might has an important international relation. Just see, you know, what Trump said about Denmark, most precisely Greenland, which is part of Denmark, or about Panama, or about Gaza, and even about Canada. He considers that he can change the borders by forces if he considers that there is an international interest or so-called national interest to do so. And that's exactly, you know, the same languages that both Putin and Xi Jinping are using. Putin towards Ukraine or Moldova, Georgia, Belarus, etc., but also Xi Jinping vis-à-vis Taiwan. So they can basically change the border by force. They accept the principle of so-called zones of influence that was banned for the international law, you know, in the Charter of Paris of 1990. So basically, they want to change the way the people consider international relations. They want to put the world order born after World War III up and down. And I think so there is a kind of, that's why, ideological revisionism that characterizes both Putin and Trump.
So let's talk about Europe, because it is very interesting. We have a new US administration, its new vision of world order, maybe in particular as well. But Europe also has a war on its continent. And the question is probably what may be the role of Europe under these new conditions, because we as well hear many different statements. So the question is, what may be the role and what are the real opportunities?
Well, first of all, I think that's an historical momentum for Europe. Basically, either they step in their own defense effort, or they will die. And I am talking about Europe, not only about the EU, because right now, I mean, which is important for Europe is not to have only the EU, but it have to have the EU plus the UK, Norway, two countries who are supporting Ukraine, plus I would say Canada, plus one day, of course, always also Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, maybe some others, basically because you must have a gathering of all democratic countries who are sharing the same worldview and who are basically like-minded countries against revisionist power that are, of course, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but right now, very unfortunately, sadly, the US as well. So basically, we have certainly to something that I said since years. We have to turn our own economies into war economies. We have certainly, sorry, it's not new, but that's something that I said since more than 3 years. We have certainly to step in our defense effort to at least 4 or 5% of the GDP. And part, of course, of these sums must be devoted to the Ukrainian forces, because the ones who are basically at the front line for the moment are the Ukrainians. They are fighting for our own freedom. They are fighting for Europe. So we have to support whatever it takes, or whatever victory it takes, not how long as it takes, but whatever it takes. And that's a meaningful change. We have to Ukraine, I think, to support the Ukrainians. And certainly, I think that that's something that I said also since February 24th, 2022, and that I'm repeating and repeat it each time I came back to Ukraine, 5 times since the beginning of the war. Certainly, we will never win a war by leading from behind. We cannot win a war if we are not basically involved in it, one way or another. And that's something that I am saying to the Europeans. And I think if I hear the speeches recently, 2 speeches or 3 speeches of my own president, Emmanuel Macron, some speeches of the Polish authorities, of the incoming new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, of Kirchheimer and others, I think they know, even if it's too late in my view, but still, I mean, they have a clear view that Russia will never stop. And they won't stop at the border of Ukraine. They will continue if we allow them to do so. So basically, I think we still have to change, and I think there is still a progress, I mean, in their own narratives to make. We have to consider that there is only one war aim, which is the full victory of Ukraine and the radical defeat of Russia. And any kind of solutions, that's why, I am very much criticizing the very idea of peace talks, peace settlement, negotiation, etc. The very idea that we could negotiate something with Russia, in my view, is a kind of a fool's game.
Yeah, but what we are hearing from the White House, for example, that the negotiations and contacts with Russia are important because it is a side in a war. So, it depends on Russia, 50%. Will it stop the war or not? I would even say 100%. It depends on Russia. So, they have this argument that you need to talk to Russia.
They have the argument, but still at the same time, they say, well, we cannot accept the Ukrainians to lose because they are perfectly aware of the fact that if there is a kind of peace deal and if it becomes an opportunity for Russia to rearm, they will be the next on the list. But I think they still have, and I think you're perfectly right on that, they still have, to go further in their narrative. They are still in their narrative remaining halfway. They don't have, I will say, right now, the straightforwardness that I could expect from them. They have to speak more bluntly than they are doing right now. Certainly they have. Yes.
What you mentioned about the potential threat that Europe is under, and you mentioned the speech of French President Macron. Much attention was drawn to this speech, both in Ukraine and abroad. I can only imagine what was the reaction in France. So we see that a number of European leaders, they accept the new reality and they talk about it, what is very important. My question is, do you see that European society and French society in particular realizes the threat? Because many decisions, I suppose, will be dependent on what the society, what they accept or not.
I think, first of all, I think there is a lot of progresses. Still, you have a huge majority, and even more, that increased even recently, a majority of the French people who are supporting Ukraine and who are considering Russia a clear threat. A huge majority. Not, 100%, of course, but you have a huge majority. At the same time, you still have, of course, and they are very visible, very vocal, You have a lot of propagandists in France, even some politicians and famous politicians, prime minister, etc. People who are basically never condemned Russia, who are siding with Russia. And you also a kind of press mogul in France with a lot of with a newspaper, a radio, a TV, etc., who are spreading basically kind of Russian narratives. And in my view, that's very dangerous. And we have certainly to retaliate to that because it could do a lot of damages. But nevertheless, you have a majority of French people supporting. But we have certainly to do more to counter the Russian propaganda that is certainly having a kind of a new surge, in France, in the recent weeks. But we must not be afraid, and we have certainly to say also very positive things. And that's what I'm saying. I made a lot of TV shows, each and every day, and some things that I say in very popular TV shows, in France, saying, well, if we turn France economy, but also other European economy into war economy, that will be very beneficial in terms of growth, in terms of employment, in terms of revenues for the people. Because you remember the Draghi report, last fall said that Europe has lost a lot of advantages, in the global competitions, especially in terms of innovation, big tech, etc. So I think that to turn our own economies, especially if the US becomes no more reliable in terms of weapon delivery, it will be something which would be very beneficial for the Europeans and for the European people. So I think we must not say, it will war economy, you will be suffering very much. We must have a positive speech to convince also the people that there will be certainly hard times, there will be some sacrifices to make, but not so many. We don't ask, also the French people or the Polish people or the Belgian people, to go to the front and to go to war. No, we are not asking them, but you have a lot of lies about that, saying Macron wants basically you to die for Ukraine. No, we never ask, the people to die for Ukraine. And also President Zelensky, I remember, said that very clearly after Macron said, it was on February 26th last year, 2024, and President Zelensky said, we are not asking the young Ukrainians to die for Ukraine. And I think that's still something that is very important. It's not the general mobilizations, but we have certainly to convince also the French people, Italian people, Spanish people, that there will be a lot of assets, technological assets, and a lot of advantages, is a new step for the European economies.
In this speech, French President Macron, he said that French soldiers may one day need to come to Ukraine and to guarantee the ceasefire. We've heard from the Russian side that Russia does not accept any idea of any kind of European contingent on Ukraine's territory. Do you see that this may really have any kind of a practical implementation?
Yes, absolutely. I think whatever the outcome of the so-called negotiations, and I repeat that I am not comfortable with the word. Certainly, I think there will be certainly French troops or Polish troops or Lithuanian or Baltic states troops or British troops, and there is still an agreement between the two major European states, France and the UK on that. There will be certainly troops on the ground. And I think there is we don't care about the position of Russia. It's not because Russia say no that there won't be troops. And I think first of all, do not care about what Russia is saying. First lesson. The second thing is we have certainly to be more precise on what will be the missions of those troops. It's not the question to secure the border. I think that's certainly misleading. It's basically to have troops not necessarily on the border, but on Ukrainian soil, able to retaliate if Russia is breaking the ceasefire or peace agreement or whatever we call it. And that's very important because those troops must have receive clear instruction, and there must be a doctrine framed by the head of state and government. If those troops or if Ukraine are attacked, what will those troops do? And basically, they must be ready to strike in depth on Russian territories if they are attacked or if the Ukrainians are attacked. And it must be very clear. So we must go, into those practicalities. And of course, there is something very concrete on that. Because I think that at the beginning, when he launched that, Macron was not very convincing, on February 26, 2024. But no, you see more European countries accepting the very idea. So I think this idea is gaining traction among the European leaders. No, we have to define the very concrete practicalities, when, at what condition, at what moment. But with that we can wait, because we still have absolutely no idea of the kind of agreements could be reached, if any.
As a conclusion, if we imagine the worst case scenario that the US support is suspended to Ukraine, and we have this situation where there is a war ongoing between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine and Europe, they are on their own. How we survive? How do you see this?
I mean, in my view, the worst case scenario is not likely to happen for two reasons. The first one is that I am very confident that the Ukrainians will have the forces, the might, to fight against Russians. I am not a defeatist, and I think that, even counting on its own resources, Ukraine, it will be able to resist. The second thing is that I do not see that Europeans will stop, the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. And if we consider their might, basically they are able to produce much more. The very idea that Europeans basically are not able to produce more weapons and to step in, in the war effort, in my view, is wrong. And basically, no, you have, as I said, the consciousness of people like Macron, Starmer, Merz, of course, Tusk and others, of course, the Baltic states since long, that there is an existential threat, not only for Ukraine, but for them as well. So certainly, I think they won't abandon Ukraine. So for me, the worst won't happen. And I am very confident that, of course, Ukraine will continue to fight. What I witnessed each time I came back to Ukraine since the beginning of the all-out war waged by Russia is that the Ukrainians really are willing to consider their own strategic autonomy. When I was speaking with a very senior official, I won't give the name, they consider basically that there is absolutely no trust that they could have, especially vis-à-vis the US right now, but vis-à-vis also some of the Europeans. So I think they will do their best in the years to come to be able to defend themselves by their own. And they are already working on that. Just see what happened, with the drones launched 2 days ago, on Moscow suburbs, or even Nizhny Novgorod, which is even far away than Moscow. And I think they will continue. So I am very optimistic about the Ukrainian capabilities.
Thank you very much for your optimism, and thank you very much for your time, Mr. Tenzer.
It was my great pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much.